The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Forward Operating Base Zenith, a remote outpost nestled in the unforgiving terrain of hostile territory. The air shimmered with heat, and dust clung to everything like a second skin. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had been stationed here for 3 weeks now, leading a classified operation that would determine the success of a much larger mission. At 32 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every stripe on her uniform through blood, sweat, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Sarah stood outside the makeshift command center, reviewing satellite imagery on her tablet. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her fatigues bore the subtle insignia that most people wouldn't recognize. That was intentional. Her team operated in the shadows, and anonymity was their greatest asset. She had learned long ago that being underestimated was sometimes an advantage, especially in a field dominated by men who couldn't see past their own assumptions. The base was a temporary installation, housing a mix of regular Army personnel, intelligence officers, and a rotating cast of special operations units. Sarah's team had arrived under the cover of darkness 3 weeks prior, and they kept to themselves. Her 6-person unit consisted of the best operators the Navy had to offer, each one handpicked for their unique skills and unshakable discipline. They trained before dawn, ran operations during the day, and planned late into the night. There was no room for error in their line of work. As Sarah walked toward the communal facilities, she noticed a group of Army Rangers gathered near the shower trailers. There were about 8 of them, fresh-faced and cocky, the kind of soldiers who thought their Ranger tab made them invincible. They were laughing loudly, sharing stories about their latest training exercise. Sarah paid them no mind. She had seen countless versions of these men throughout her career, and she knew better than to engage with unnecessary bravado. She carried her shower kit and a change of clothes. Looking forward to washing away the grit and grime of another 18-hour workday, the shower facilities were separated by gender, but in a combat zone, the arrangements were often crude and makeshift. The women's section was just a few trailers down from the men's, separated by thin metal walls and questionable plumbing. As Sarah approached, one of the Rangers noticed her. He was tall, with a sunburned face and the kind of smirk that suggested he thought highly of himself. He elbowed his buddy and nodded in her direction. The group turned to look at her, their conversation dying down as they assessed the newcomer. "Hey there, sweetheart," the tall one called out. "You lost?" "The admin building is on the other side of the base." Sarah kept walking, her expression neutral. She had heard variations of this greeting 1,000 times before. It never got more creative, and it never bothered her the way these men hoped it would. "I'm talking to you," he persisted, stepping into her path. His friends gathered around, forming a loose semicircle. "What's a pretty thing like you doing out here with the big boys?" Sarah stopped and looked up at him calmly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice level and professional. "I need to get past." The tall Ranger grinned wider, clearly enjoying himself. "Oh, she's got attitude." "I like that," he turned to his friends. "What do you think, boys? Should we let her through?" Another Ranger, shorter but stockier, chimed in. "Maybe she's one of those paper pushers from Intel. You here to file some reports, honey?" Sarah remained silent, her jaw tightening slightly. She had dealt with this particular brand of disrespect more times than she could count. The key was not to give them the reaction they wanted. She shifted her weight, calculating the quickest route around the group. "Come on, don't be shy," the tall one continued. "What's your job here? You a nurse? A secretary?" He laughed, and his friends joined in. "Or are you just here to boost morale?" The stocky Ranger leaned in closer. "You know what? I bet she's never even seen real action. Probably spent her whole career behind a desk, pushing papers and making coffee for the real soldiers." Sarah's eyes flickered with something sharp, but her voice remained steady. "I need to get to the showers." "Move aside." The tall Ranger crossed his arms. "The showers, huh? You know, we were just about to head that way ourselves. Maybe you should join us. We could show you how real soldiers clean up after a hard day's work." His friends erupted in laughter, slapping each other on the back and making crude gestures. The tall one stepped closer, invading Sarah's personal space with deliberate arrogance. "What do you say, honey? Join us in the showers. We'll make sure you get real clean." The mocking continued, each ranger trying to outdo the other with increasingly inappropriate comments. They circled around her like wolves, feeding off each other's energy. To them, this was harmless fun, a way to blow off steam and assert their dominance over someone they perceived as weak and out of place. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chen wasn't just any officer. She wasn't a desk jockey or a support staffer. She was the commanding officer of one of the most elite SEAL teams in the entire United States military. She had completed Hell Week, survived advanced combat training, and led missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. She had earned her trident the hard way, proving herself against odds that would have broken most men. And she was about to remind these rangers exactly who they were dealing with. Sarah took a slow breath, her mind calculating the situation. She could walk away, report them to their commanding officer, and let the chain of command handle it. But she had learned something important during her years in special operations. Sometimes the best lessons were taught directly. In the moment, by the person being disrespected, she set down her shower kit carefully and straightened to her full height. Though she was shorter than most of the men surrounding her, there was something in her posture that suddenly commanded attention. Her eyes, which had been neutral and patient, now carried the weight of someone who had stared down far more dangerous threats than a group of cocky soldiers. "You want to know what I do here?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet but carrying an edge that made the nearest ranger take an involuntary step back. The tall one, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, grinned even wider. "Yeah, sweetheart. Enlighten us. What's your important job on this base?" Sarah looked each of them in the eye, one by one, letting the silence stretch out. The laughter died down as they began to sense that something was different about this woman. She wasn't backing down, wasn't getting flustered, wasn't giving them any of the reactions they expected. "My job," Sarah said slowly, "is classified. But I can tell you this much. I'm here to do something that requires more skill, more discipline, and more courage than anything you've ever done in your entire military career." The stocky ranger snorted. "Is that right? And what makes you think you're so special?" Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the smile of a predator who had just decided to reveal her teeth. "Because in about 30 seconds, your commanding officer is going to walk around that corner, and when he does, you're all going to wish you had kept your mouths shut and your eyes on your own business." The rangers looked at each other, confusion replacing their earlier bravado. "What are you talking about?" the tall one demanded. Sarah glanced at her watch. 20 seconds. The group shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't going the way they had expected. The woman in front of them wasn't acting like a victim or a paper pusher. She was acting like someone who held all the cards and was simply waiting for the right moment to play them. 15 seconds, Sarah said calmly. The tall ranger's smirk faltered. "You're bluffing." 10 seconds. Footsteps echoed from around the corner of the nearest building. Heavy, purposeful footsteps that made several of the rangers glance nervously in that direction. 5 seconds, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. A figure appeared, and the rangers immediately snapped to attention. It was their battalion commander, a grizzled colonel with 25 years of service and a reputation for not tolerating any nonsense from his troops. But he wasn't alone. Walking beside him were 2 other officers, both wearing uniforms that made the rangers' eyes widen in recognition. One was a Navy captain, and the other was a senior chief petty officer, whose chest was covered in ribbons that told the story of a career spent in the most dangerous corners of the world. They were heading directly toward the group. None of them looked happy. Sarah picked up her shower kit and stepped around the suddenly silent rangers. "Enjoy your conversation, gentlemen," she said softly. "I'm sure it's going to be very educational." As she walked away, she heard the colonel's voice boom across the compound. "What in the hell do you rangers think you're doing harassing one of my officers?" The tall ranger's voice, now stripped of all its earlier confidence, stammered out a response. "Sir, we didn't know she was an officer. We thought she was just what, soldier?" The colonel interrupted. "Just a woman? So you thought you could disrespect her? Did it occur to any of you idiots to check who you were talking to before running your mouths?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she continued toward the showers. She didn't need to hear the rest of the conversation. She had been in the military long enough to know exactly how it would play out. Those Rangers were about to receive the kind of dressing down that they would remember for the rest of their careers. What they still didn't know was just how badly they had miscalculated. They thought they were mocking some random female officer, someone they could intimidate and belittle. They had no idea that they had just insulted one of the most highly trained and respected special operations officers in the entire military. And they were about to find out exactly what that meant. The next morning arrived with the same brutal heat. But the atmosphere on forward operating base Zenith had shifted dramatically. Word traveled fast in military circles, especially when someone had made a spectacular mistake. By breakfast time, every soldier on the base knew about the Rangers who had harassed the wrong woman. Sarah Chen sat in the Special Operations briefing room, reviewing mission parameters with her team. The room was sparse, containing only a large table, several chairs, and secure communication equipment. Maps covered one wall, marked with coordinates and notations that would mean nothing to an outsider, but told a complete story to those trained to read them. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, sat across from her. He was a veteran SEAL with 12 years of experience and a reputation for being able to infiltrate anywhere. Next to him was Chief Petty Officer Jennifer Kim, their communications specialist and one of the best tactical minds Sarah had ever worked with. The rest of the team filtered in, each one carrying the quiet confidence that came from knowing they were among the best at what they did. "Heard you had an interesting encounter yesterday," Marcus said with a slight grin. "The whole base is talking about it." Sarah looked up from her tablet. "Not interesting. Just disappointing. You'd think by now people would know better." Jennifer shook her head. "Those Rangers are getting absolutely crucified. Their CO has them running punishment drills in full gear. In this heat, I almost feel sorry for them." "Almost," Marcus added with a chuckle. Sarah's expression remained neutral. They made their choice. Now they live with the consequences. "Can we focus on the mission?" The room fell silent as the team turned their attention to the large screen on the wall. Sarah pulled up a satellite image of a compound located approximately 40 kilometers from their current position. The structure was nestled in a valley, surrounded by rough terrain that made conventional approach nearly impossible.
"Our target,"
Sarah began, her voice taking on the professional tone she used during operational briefings, "is a high-value individual known as the broker. Intelligence suggests he's brokering deals between insurgent groups, facilitating weapons transfers and coordinating attacks against coalition forces. He's been on our radar for 8 months, but he's careful, moves locations frequently, uses multiple layers of security, and never stays in one place longer than 72 hours. Marcus leaned forward, studying the image. "What makes this location special?" Sarah zoomed in on the compound. 2 days ago, we intercepted communications suggesting he's meeting with representatives from 3 different insurgent cells. It's rare for him to expose himself like this, which means whatever they're planning is significant. Our orders are to capture him alive if possible, eliminate him if necessary, and gather any intelligence we can find on site." Chief Kim pointed to a section of the terrain surrounding the compound. "That's a hell of an approach. No cover for at least 2 clicks in any direction. If they have sentries posted, they'll see us coming, which is why we're not approaching on foot," Sarah replied. She pulled up another image, this one showing a narrow ravine that wound through the mountains. This dried riverbed runs within 500 meters of the compound. It's deep enough to provide cover, and satellite imagery shows no evidence of regular patrols in that area. We insert via helicopter at 0 to 100 hours, 20 clicks out to avoid detection. We hump it to the ravine, use it to get close, then go over the wall under cover of darkness. The team studied the plan in silence, each member mentally walking through their role in the operation. This was what they had trained for, what they had dedicated their lives to. Every mission carried risks, but careful planning and flawless execution were what separated special operations units from regular forces. As Sarah continued the briefing, there was a knock on the door. She paused, slightly irritated by the interruption. "Enter." The door opened, and the battalion commander from the previous day stepped inside. followed by the tall ranger who had led the harassment. The soldier looked like he had been through hell. His uniform was soaked with sweat, his face was sunburned and drawn, and his eyes were fixed firmly on the floor. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," the colonel said formally, "I apologize for interrupting your briefing. Specialist Davis here has something he needs to say to you." Sarah set down her tablet and stood. Her team remained seated but watched the exchange with interest. Marcus had a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Specialist Davis stepped forward, his posture rigid at attention. He still wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes. "Ma'am," he began, his voice hoarse, "I want to apologize for my conduct yesterday. My behavior was unprofessional, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable. There is no excuse for how I spoke to you or the things I said. I failed to uphold the standards of the United States Army, and I failed as a soldier and as a person." Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. She could see that he was genuinely contrite, that the last 18 hours had been a brutal education in humility. But she also knew that apologies meant nothing if the lesson wasn't truly learned. "Specialist Davis," she said quietly, "do you know what I do?" He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. I was informed that you're a SEAL team commander. And do you understand what that means?" "Yes, ma'am." Sarah took a step closer. "I don't think you do. You see, when you and your friends decided to mock me yesterday, you weren't just disrespecting a female officer. You were disrespecting someone who has completed training that 90% of men can't finish. Someone who has led missions in places you've only seen on the news. Someone who has made decisions under pressure that would break most people." Davis's face flushed with shame. "Ma'am," Sarah held up a hand. "I'm not finished. The military is changing, Specialist. There are women in special operations now, women in combat roles, women who can do everything you can do, and often do it better. But here's what you need to understand. We're not asking for special treatment. We're not asking you to lower your standards or pretend we're something we're not. We're asking you to judge us by our performance, our skills, and our dedication to the mission. Nothing more, nothing less." The room was completely silent. Even the colonel seemed content to let Sarah speak. "Yesterday, you made assumptions based on my gender," Sarah continued. "You saw a woman and automatically assumed I was less capable, less important, less worthy of respect. That kind of thinking doesn't just disrespect me. It disrespects every female service member who has ever put on a uniform. It disrespects the mission, because it means you're not evaluating the people around you accurately. And in combat, that kind of mistake gets people killed." Davis finally looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Ma'am, you're right. I understand now. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Sarah nodded slowly. "Apology accepted. But here's what I want you to do, Specialist. I want you to remember this moment every single time you interact with a female soldier from now on. I want you to check your assumptions, question your biases, and judge people by what they can do, not what they look like. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am. I will." "Good. Because the military needs soldiers who can adapt, who can see beyond their own limited perspectives, and who can work effectively with anyone, regardless of gender, race, or background. If you can't do that, you'll never be more than mediocre."
Oh.
Dismissed. Davis saluted sharply, his face a mixture of relief and lingering shame. He turned and left the room, followed by the colonel, who gave Sarah a respectful nod before closing the door behind them. Marcus was the first to break the silence. "Well said, boss." Sarah returned to her seat and picked up her tablet. "Let's get back to work. We have a mission to plan, and I don't want to waste any more time on this." But as the team resumed their briefing, there was a new energy in the room. They had seen their commander handle a difficult situation with grace and strength, reinforcing why they had chosen to follow her into the most dangerous situations imaginable. The rest of the day was spent in meticulous preparation. Sarah went over every detail of the operation with her team, identifying potential problems and developing contingencies. They reviewed floor plans of similar compounds, practiced close quarters combat techniques, and rehearsed communication protocols. By evening, they were as ready as they could possibly be. Sarah stood outside the operations center as the sun began to set. painting the desert in shades of orange and red. She thought about the mission ahead, about the risks they would face, and about the rangers who had learned a hard lesson about respect. She had spent her entire career fighting 2 battles, one against America's enemies, and another against the prejudice and assumptions that came with being a woman in a male-dominated field. It was exhausting sometimes, having to prove herself over and over again, having to work twice as hard for half the recognition. But it was also what made her excellent at what she did. Every obstacle had sharpened her skills. Every moment of doubt had strengthened her resolve. Her team approached, each one carrying their gear and wearing the focused expression that came before a mission. They didn't see her as a woman trying to do a man's job. They saw her as their commanding officer, someone who had earned their trust and respect through countless operations and unwavering competence. "Ready when you are, boss," Marcus said. Sarah nodded, pushing thoughts of the previous day's incident from her mind. There was work to do, a mission to complete, and lives depending on their success. Everything else was just noise. The helicopter blades cut through the night air with a rhythmic thump that was felt more than heard over the roar of the engines. Sarah Chen sat in the darkness of the aircraft's interior, surrounded by her team. Each operator was lost in their own pre-mission ritual. Some checking weapons for the 100th time, others sitting in quiet meditation, preparing their minds for what lay ahead. The insertion point was approaching. Sarah could feel the helicopter beginning its descent. The pilot expertly navigating through the mountain passes using night vision technology. They were flying low and fast, staying below radar coverage and using the terrain to mask their approach. This was the most vulnerable part of the mission. If enemy forces had anticipated their arrival, this would be when they were most exposed. But Sarah's team had done this dance before. They had inserted into hostile territory dozens of times, and each mission had taught them something new about survival, adaptation, and the importance of trusting the people beside you. The crew chief gave the 2-minute warning, holding up 2 fingers in the dim red light of the cabin. Sarah's team immediately shifted into action mode, conducting final equipment checks and preparing to disembark. Every piece of gear had been selected for a specific purpose. Every weapon had been zeroed and tested. Every member of the team knew their role down to the smallest detail. Sarah checked her rifle one last time, then looked at each member of her team. Marcus gave her a confident nod. Jennifer adjusted her communications headset and gave a thumbs up. The others signaled their readiness in turn. This was a well-oiled machine. Honed through years of training and real-world experience, the helicopter touched down briefly in a cloud of dust and sand. The team poured out in perfect sequence, weapons up and scanning for threats. Within seconds, they had established a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. The helicopter lifted off immediately, its rotor wash whipping up a storm of debris before it disappeared into the darkness. Leaving the team alone in hostile territory, silence settled over the desert like a blanket. Sarah activated her night vision goggles, bathing the world in shades of green. She used hand signals to communicate with her team, and they moved out in formation, covering 20 kilometers of rough terrain with the kind of efficient movement that came from countless hours of practice. The landscape was unforgiving, all sharp rocks and loose sand that threatened to give way underfoot. They moved in complete silence, communicating only through hand signals and the occasional whispered word through their communication system. Every sound was potentially dangerous out here. Every shadow could hide an enemy after 3 hours of movement. They reached the dried riverbed Sarah had identified during the briefing. It was perfect, deep enough to conceal their approach and winding, enough to prevent anyone from seeing them until they were almost on top of the compound. The team descended into the ravine and began the final approach to their target. Sarah led from the front, her senses heightened to an almost supernatural degree. This was where all her training came together, where instinct and experience merged into something that felt almost like precognition. She could sense threats before seeing them, could read the terrain in ways that kept her team safe. They covered the final 500 meters in absolute silence. As they approached the compound, Sarah held up a fist, signaling the team to halt. She crawled forward to the edge of the ravine and studied there, objective through a small spotting scope. The compound was larger than the satellite images had suggested, with high walls and multiple structures inside. Lights blazed in several windows, and she could see guards patrolling the perimeter. They were well armed and appeared professional, not the usual undisciplined militia that dominated this region. This was a serious security force protecting a high-value target. Sarah memorized the guard patterns, counting the number of sentries and noting their routes. She spotted cameras mounted at strategic points along the walls, though their positioning suggested they were more for show than actual security. The real threat was the human element. The men with rifles who were paid to die protecting whoever was inside. She crawled back to where her team waited and used hand signals to brief them on what she had observed. Marcus would take 2 operators and scale the wall on the western side, creating a diversion if needed. Jennifer and the remaining team member would stay with Sarah for the primary insertion through the eastern gate, which appeared to be the most lightly guarded. The team moved into position with practiced efficiency. Sarah watched the seconds tick by on her watch, waiting for the perfect moment to initiate the breach. Guard patterns were predictable, and there was always a window where overlapping coverage created a blind spot. She just had to be patient enough to find it. At precisely 0300 hours, Sarah gave the signal. Marcus's team moved first, using a grappling hook to scale the western wall in complete silence. They disappeared over the top like ghosts. Providing overwatch and securing their sector of the compound, Sarah led her element toward the eastern gate. One of the guards had stepped away to smoke a cigarette, leaving his partner alone at the entrance. Sarah approached from his blind side, moving with the kind of fluid grace that made her seem almost invisible. The guard never knew what hit him. One moment he was standing at his post, and the next he was unconscious on the ground, taken down with a chokehold that left him alive but incapacitated. The team was inside. Sarah signaled her operators to fan out and clear the immediate area while she moved toward the central building. Intelligence suggested that the broker conducted his meetings in the main structure, a 2-story building that dominated the compound center. As they approached, Sarah heard voices coming from an open window on the 2nd floor. She recognized the language as Arabic mixed with English, a common occurrence in these international criminal meetings. She signaled Jennifer to set up surveillance equipment while she covered the approach. Suddenly, everything went wrong. A guard emerged from a side building directly in their path. There was no time to take him down quietly. He saw them, and his eyes went wide with surprise. Sarah made a split-second decision, one that would determine whether this mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. She fired a single suppressed shot, hitting the guard's center mass. He dropped without a sound, but his radio had been active. Someone on the other end had heard something, and within seconds, alarms began blaring throughout the compound. Protect. Sarah shouted into her radio, abandoning all pretense of stealth. Execute contingency plan, Delta. We're going loud. Ah! The compound erupted into chaos. Guards poured out of buildings, weapons firing in every direction. Sarah's team responded with lethal precision, their superior training and equipment allowing them to dominate the firefight. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Marcus's team provided covering fire from their elevated position, taking down guards as they emerged from cover. Sarah led her element up the stairs of the main building, clearing rooms with textbook efficiency. Each door could hide death, but they moved through the structure like water flowing downhill. It's unstoppable and inevitable. They reached the 2nd floor to find a reinforced door at the end of the hallway. Sarah didn't hesitate. She planted a breaching charge, and the explosion that followed blew the door off its hinges. The team poured through the opening, weapons up and ready. Inside was a luxurious office that looked completely out of place in this desert compound. 3 men in expensive suits stood frozen in shock, caught completely off guard by the sudden assault. One of them matched the photograph Sarah had memorized during her briefings. The broker. Get down on the ground, Sarah commanded, her rifle trained on the 3 men. Hands where I can see them? 2 of the men immediately complied, dropping to their knees with their hands behind their heads. But the broker reached for something inside his jacket. Sarah didn't think. She reacted. Putting 2 rounds into his shoulder that spun him around and sent him crashing to the floor, Jennifer was already moving. Securing the 2 compliant prisoners while Sarah approached the wounded broker, he was alive, clutching his shoulder and groaning in pain. Good. They needed him alive to extract the intelligence he carried in his head. "Clear the room," Sarah ordered. Her team swept through the office, gathering documents, hard drives, anything else that looked valuable from an intelligence perspective. They had maybe 3 minutes before reinforcements arrived, or the situation became completely untenable. Outside, the sound of gunfire was intensifying. Marcus's voice crackled over the radio. "Boss, we've got vehicles approaching from the north. Looks like additional security forces. We need to move now." Sarah made the call. "Extract in 2 minutes. Rally point Beta. Jennifer, get that intel packaged. We're taking the broker with us." The team moved with urgency, but without panic. Sarah zip-tied the broker's hands and hauled him to his feet. He was older than his file photo suggested, maybe mid-50s, with silver hair and the kind of face that had seen too many deals made in dark places. "You're making a mistake," he gasped in accented English. "You don't know what you're doing." Sarah ignored him, pushing him toward the door. Her team provided cover as they descended the stairs and made their way back to the extraction point. The compound was now fully alert, with guards firing from multiple positions. But Sarah's team was already moving, using suppressing fire and tactical movement to disengage from the enemy. They reached the rally point, a clearing 500 meters from the compound where their extraction helicopter would meet them. Marcus's team arrived 30 seconds later, all present and accounted for. Sarah did a quick head count and breathed a sigh of relief. Everyone had made it out. The helicopter appeared out of the darkness, its pilot showing the kind of courage that made him invaluable to special operations. He brought the aircraft down in a combat landing, staying just long enough for the team to board before lifting off and banking hard away from the compound. Sarah sat in the vibrating interior of the helicopter, the broker secured between 2 of her operators. Her team was battered but intact, and they had completed their mission. The intelligence they had gathered would be analyzed by experts, and the broker would be interrogated by professionals who knew how to extract information from even the most reluctant sources. The morning sun was already climbing toward its zenith when the helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Zenith. Sarah Chen stepped off the aircraft, her uniform still dusty and stained from the mission, her face showing the fatigue that came from 36 hours without sleep. But there was also something else in her expression: satisfaction. The mission had been a complete success. The broker had been transferred to a secure facility for interrogation. The intelligence gathered from the compound was already being processed by analysts, who would spend weeks extracting every possible piece of information from hard drives, documents, and encrypted communications. Early reports suggested they had disrupted at least 3 major operations and identified dozens of insurgent operatives who could now be targeted. Sarah's team dispersed to their quarters, each member eager for food, a shower, and sleep. But as Sarah walked across the base toward the debriefing center, she noticed something unusual. Soldiers were stopping what they were doing to watch her pass. Some nodded respectfully. Others saluted. Even though regulations didn't require it in this informal setting, word had spread about the mission's success. In the close quarters of a forward operating base, there were no secrets. Everyone knew that the SEAL team had pulled off something extraordinary, and they knew who had led them. But Sarah also noticed the group of rangers who had harassed her days earlier. They were standing near the motor pool, and when they saw her approaching, their reaction was dramatically different from their first encounter. Specialist Davis, the tall one who had led the harassment, immediately stood at attention. His companions did the same, their faces showing a mixture of respect and residual shame. Sarah could have walked past them without acknowledgement. She had nothing to prove to these men anymore, but something made her stop. She approached the group, and Davis's face went pale. Clearly expecting another dressing down, "Specialist Davis," Sarah said, her voice carrying none of the edge it had held during their previous encounter. He responded, his posture rigid. Sarah studied him for a moment, then surprised everyone by extending her hand. "I heard you and your team performed well on your patrol yesterday. Good work." Davis hesitated, then shook her hand, his relief visible. "Thank you, ma'am. We're trying to do better." "That's all any of us can do," Sarah replied. "Learn from our mistakes and keep moving forward." She nodded to the rest of the Rangers and continued on her way, leaving them staring after her in what looked like genuine admiration. It was a small gesture, but Sarah understood the power of leadership through example. Holding grudges served no purpose. What mattered was whether people learned and grew from their experiences. The debriefing session lasted 3 hours. Sarah walked the command staff through every phase of the operation, from insertion to extraction, highlighting both what had gone well and what could be improved. Her commander, Captain Mitchell, listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly letting Sarah tell the story in her own way. When she finished, Captain Mitchell leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Outstanding work, Commander. This operation is going to have ripple effects across the entire theater. The intelligence alone is worth its weight in gold." "The team performed exceptionally, sir," Sarah replied. "Everyone executed their roles perfectly. I'm putting you and your team in 4 commendations," Mitchell said. "What you accomplished last night was nothing short of remarkable." Sarah nodded, accepting the praise but already thinking about the next mission, the next challenge. This was the life she had chosen, the career she had fought so hard to build. There would always be another operation, another objective, another opportunity to prove that excellence had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with dedication, skill, and an unwavering commitment to the mission. As she left the briefing room, Sarah ran into Jennifer, who had been waiting outside. "The team wants to celebrate tonight," Jennifer said with a grin. "Nothing crazy, just dinner at the DFAC and maybe some cards afterward." "You in?" Sarah smiled, feeling the tension of the past few days finally beginning to ease. "Absolutely. We've earned it." That evening, as the sun painted the desert sky in brilliant colors, Sarah sat with her team in the dining facility. They laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of being alive and together. These were the moments that made everything else worthwhile, the bonds forged through shared danger and mutual trust. Across the dining facility, Sarah noticed Specialist Davis and his ranger companions. Davis caught her eye and raised his cup in a subtle salute. Sarah returned the gesture with a slight nod. There was an understanding there now, a respect that had been earned through actions rather than words. After dinner, as the team gathered for their card game, Marcus dealt the cards and glanced at Sarah with an amused expression. "So, boss, are you going to tell us what you said to those Rangers the other day? The whole base has been trying to figure it out." Sarah picked up her cards and studied them before responding. "I just reminded them that appearances can be deceiving, that you should never judge someone's capabilities based on what they look like." "This must have been some reminder," Jennifer said. "Davis looks like he found religion." Sarah shrugged. "Sometimes people need a wake-up call. The important thing is whether they learn from it." As the game progressed and the conversation flowed, Sarah found herself reflecting on her journey to this moment. She thought about the countless hours of training, the physical and mental challenges she had overcome, the obstacles she had faced simply because of her gender. She thought about the men who had doubted her, the instructors who had tried to break her, the peers who had assumed she couldn't hack it, but she had proven them all wrong. Not through anger or confrontation, but through consistent excellence and unwavering determination. She had earned her place among the elite special operations community, and she had done it by the same standards as everyone else. With no shortcuts and no excuses, the story of what happened at Forward Operating Base Zenith would spread beyond that dusty outpost. It would become one of those legends that circulated through the military, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. Some versions would embellish the details, others would miss the point entirely. But the core truth would remain. A group of cocky soldiers had mocked a woman at the showers, not knowing she led one of the most elite units in the military, and they had learned a lesson they would never forget. But for Sarah, the incident was just a footnote in a larger story. What mattered was the mission, the team, and the knowledge that she was making a difference. Every operation she led, every objective she accomplished, was another small victory in the ongoing battle to prove that women belonged in special operations, that they could perform at the highest levels, and that the military was stronger when it embraced diversity and judged people by their merits rather than their gender. As the night wore on and the card game ended, Sarah stood outside her quarters, looking up at the stars that blazed in the desert sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to lead and excel. The war was far from over, and there was still so much work to be done. As the night wore on and the card game ended, Sarah stood outside her quarters, looking up at the stars that blazed in the desert sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to lead and excel. The war was far from over, and there was still so much work to be done. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had come a long way from the young woman who had first decided to pursue a career in special operations, who had endured the doubts and the skepticism and the outright hostility. She had proven herself again and again, and she had helped pave the way for the women who would come after her. Sarah thought about Specialist Davis and the Rangers, about how a moment of thoughtless disrespect had turned into an opportunity for growth and learning. She hoped they would carry that lesson forward, that they would think twice before making assumptions about anyone based on superficial characteristics. The military needed soldiers who could see beyond the surface, who could recognize capability and competence wherever it existed. As she turned to head inside, Sarah noticed a young female soldier walking across the base, probably heading to her shift or coming off duty. The woman looked tired but determined, wearing her uniform with pride despite whatever challenges she might face as a woman in the military. Sarah didn't know the soldier's name or her job, but she recognized something in the way the woman carried herself. It was the same determination Sarah had felt when she was starting out, the same refusal to be limited by other people's expectations. She hoped that young woman would have an easier path than Sarah had, that the battles Sarah and others like her had fought would make things better for the next generation. The military was changing, slowly but surely. There were more women in combat roles now, more women in leadership positions, more women proving every day that they belonged. It wasn't perfect, and there was still a long way to go, but progress was happening. Every mission Sarah led successfully, every barrier she broke down, every mind she changed through her actions rather than her words, was contributing to that progress. As Sarah finally entered her quarters and began the process of cleaning her weapon and organizing her gear for the next mission, she felt a deep sense of purpose. This was what she had been called to do, what she had trained her entire adult life to accomplish. The incident with the Rangers had been an annoyance, a distraction from the real work. But even that had served a purpose, teaching a lesson that needed to be taught and reinforcing the idea that respect should be based on competence rather than assumptions. The next morning, Sarah was back at work before dawn, planning the next operation with her team. There were always new threats to address, new missions to execute, new challenges to overcome. The work never stopped, and that was exactly how Sarah wanted it. Forward Operating Base Zenith would eventually be dismantled, its mission complete and its personnel reassigned to other locations. The soldiers who served there would scatter across the globe, carrying with them the stories and lessons learned in that harsh desert environment. And among those stories would be the tale of the woman who led the SEALs, who responded to mockery with grace and strength, and who proved through her actions what true excellence looked like. For Specialist Davis and his fellow Rangers, the memory of their encounter with Lieutenant Commander Chen would remain vivid for the rest of their careers. It would become a cautionary tale they shared with younger soldiers, a reminder about the dangers of judging people based on appearances. Some would tell the story with humor, others with embarrassment, but all would tell it with respect. And for the young women serving in the military, both at Forward Operating Base, Zenith, and at bases around the world, Sarah Chen represented something important, proof that they could achieve anything they set their minds to, that the barriers were coming down, and that excellence would always find a way to shine through. Regardless of the obstacles in its path, the sun rose higher, burning away the coolness of the desert night. Sarah stood with her team, reviewing satellite imagery and preparing for their next mission. The work continued, relentless and demanding, but immensely rewarding. This was leadership at its finest, earned through competence, maintained through consistency, and respected because it deserved to be respected. The story of what happened at the showers would fade into legend, but the impact would last far longer. It would influence how soldiers thought about their female colleagues, how leaders approached questions of diversity and capability, and how the military continued its evolution toward a more inclusive and effective force. Sarah Chen had never set out to be a symbol or a trailblazer. She had simply wanted to serve her country at the highest level possible, to push herself to her absolute limits, and to lead the kind of missions that made a real difference in the world. But in pursuing those goals with unwavering determination and exceptional skill, she had become something more, an example of what was possible when talent was given the opportunity to flourish, when barriers were broken down, and when people were judged by what they could do rather than who they were expected to be. And as she led her team forward into whatever challenges awaited them, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that she was not just completing missions. She was changing the very fabric of the military. One operation at a time, one changed mind at a time, one broken barrier at a time. The journey was far from over, but the path forward was clear. And she would walk it with the same courage and determination that had brought her this far.